Hi everyone, my name is Nelson and this is Sven, and we are co-founders of MODIFI. MODIFI stands for Modern Digital Finance. At MODIFI we solve global trade finance for small and medium-sized companies. Trade finance is actually a massive and massively broken market of some $20 trillion per annum. And at MODIFI we finance single invoices, single trades for up to 120 days for both buyers or sellers. Buyers could finance, for example, invoices which they have to pay upfront to their Asian suppliers, but have to wait for the goods to arrive in Europe to be sold on. Or it could be financing a seller, let's say an Indian SME exporter, who has to grant payment terms to their buyers, but can't afford to wait for 3 or 4 months for getting paid. So we step in between with a global platform. We have some 300 trading partners on the platform at the moment, spanning over 30 countries, and how easy it is to actually finance a trade, Sven will show us on the platform.
Thank you very much. International trade is complex, right? So it's sometimes not very digital, it's very paper and document heavy. And the reason why banks are not really financing that is that it's just too costly for the relatively small size of those SME trades to finance them. And what MODIFI is trying to do with the help of digitization is to bring those costs down and make them financeable for us, right? So this is the whole secret. How does it work? In 99% of all trades, a seller usually issues an invoice to a buyer, right? It might not be very digital, but somehow there's an invoice being issued to a buyer. And we are trying to use this invoice document and extract as much information as possible in order to assess a trade and think about if we want to finance it or not, right? I will show you how that works, right? I have an example invoice with me. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, yes. Now, slightly. And this is an invoice from an Indian exporter, right, based in Delhi, to a German-based trading GmbH who's buying, actually, I think it's garden furniture, right? So they are filling up their warehouses for hopefully a great spring and summer period. Given the weather, that might make sense. And we are using the data we find on the invoice in order to assess the invoice, right? So there's basic data on it. Usually we have an invoice due date on it. In this case, it's the 15th of February. So we have the 12th today. It's due on Saturday. So the buyer has to pay this now, or he uses MODIFI to get further time until he has to pay it, right? We also usually have the products here, some garden furniture stuff which we can also use, and obviously we have an amount which is very, very important for us, in this case 50K USD. We work with different currencies on the platform. Most of those trades are denominated in USD. The way that can work is it works for both parties, right? So the buyer can ask for financing, but also the seller can ask for financing. In this case, obviously the buyer now has to pay this invoice, or he simply uploads it in our platform and we pre-finance that 50K USD for him in just wiring the funds to the seller, and then the buyer can pay us back 30, 60 or 90 days later. Also for the seller, it would have worked. I mean, the invoice was issued on the 15th of January. The seller could simply have uploaded the invoice back then on our system, and we pay him immediately and then claim the funds 30, 60 or 90 days later from his buyer, right? So both sides we can finance, very important for us. Let's see how that works for that buyer now, because the invoice is close to being due and it has to be paid. Let's step in the shoes of the Berlin-based trading GmbH and to see how our buyer financing works. Therefore, let's go to the platform, please. Yeah, so let's straight go in the platform. As said, we are stepping in the shoes of the Berlin-based trading GmbH. This guy already has an account with us. He can simply go to create order, apply for financing. First question we are asking is, are you a seller or a buyer? As said, we are financing sellers, we are financing buyers. In this case, he has an invoice, he has to pay it, he has a buyer, right? So he chooses buyer, financing from us. Simply goes to the next page. Most important now is to how to digitize this invoice. If it's not digital, right, he can simply use his mobile phone to take a picture from it, or hopefully it is already digitized. However, it has to come in our system, very central for us. If it's digitized, we simply uploaded it here. It's this one. And what is now happening is that we are extracting, with the help of machine learning and AI, as many informations as possible from that invoice, right? As many details as possible, and in the background, run certain checks against those numbers, those trading parties, those products, right? And that's quite important for us to assess if we want to finance a trade. We have already seen that the system has pre-filled quite some information. We understand it's a 50K USD trade. We also understand when the invoice was created. The most important question now for us is when does the buyer actually wants to pay the seller? So when do we have to wire the funds, right? It's due on 15th. Maybe the buyer is very nice and wants to pay it now, so he has to give us a date, let's say the 12th. So on the 12th, that's today, MODIFI will wire the funds to the seller without having any contractual relationship with the seller, right? We only know the buyer from a contractual relationship point of view. Give us some basic reference to wire the funds. Choose a very simple repayment terms, right? We offer 30, 60, and 90 Ks for both buyer and seller financing. He can choose whatever he likes. Let's assume he chooses 60 days. It's a very, very transparent pricing. We don't like hidden fees, fixed fees, or whatever. He simply pays as he go, right? So it's only on a transactional basis. Simply clicks on continue. The seller is already mapped internally. We have identified the seller on the invoice, this Lotus Import-Export, Indian seller. We know where to wire the funds to. Also on the invoice, the buyer simply confirms that. We also understand where the goods are being delivered, also part of the invoice, and some other basic logistics informations which are not that relevant here. We just continue. In all cases, the buyer can upload additional documents if needed. In this case, it's very straightforward. We don't need anything else besides the invoice. The buyer has a final review page then to see what is actually happening here. We have a 50K USD trade, 50K invoice, which is due. The buyer wants us to pay it. He gets additional 60 days payment terms on that. Imagine how cool this actually is if you are a buyer and you need a very flexible solution for maybe a peak season or period of the year, right? So he receives 60 additional days for it. It's very, very transparent pricing, pay-as-you-go model, and there are some other stats here. It goes from India, from Delhi, to hopefully Germany. And if the buyer is fine with that, he simply submits an order. Let's see if that works. Has worked, right? So the buyer has just applied for 50K financing. What is happening now is that MODIFI will wire those funds to the seller, and hopefully the seller is